As the early 1960s evolved into the late 1960s, Lincoln Mercury planners knew it was time to start planning an all-new Continental for the 1970 model year. The 1961 to 69 Continental had not only been a hit in the sales department, where it significantly bested the sales of outgoing 1958 to 60 models, but also in the styling department, where the 61 Lincoln had set new trends that shook crosstown rivals General Motors and Chrysler, and in fact had them copying some elements of the 61 Continental style on a number of their own vehicles. Perhaps it helped at Chrysler that they hired away Elwood Engel to become their chief of design. Engel had his thumbprints on the 1961 Continental and was significantly associated with the design, and that perhaps helped him get the job when Virgil Exner was fired in 1962 at the top of Chrysler's design team. For the 1970 model year, designers envisioned a car that was more in keeping with the times, and that meant that the Continental had to grow even larger than it was in the 1961 to 69 generation. The 61 cars had a relatively short 123-inch wheelbase, downsized from the 1960 car's 131-inch wheelbase. Although over its lifetime, the wheelbase would be increased in the 1964 model year to 126 inches to give a bit more backseat legroom, which was a prime customer complaint. By 1970, there was a desire for the Continental to even become a larger and more stately car, and the wheelbase would be expanded to 127 inches, and the car would grow to 4,700 pounds in base weight. Over its lifetime, from 71 to 78, the Continental, in fact, would weigh, in some cases, upwards of 5,000 pounds. And in keeping with the theme of being big and bold, a number of styling themes were evaluated for the 70 Continental, and in fact, there were two different studios that made proposals for it. One was led by Bud Grissinger, whose studio ended up winning out on the final design proposal, but there was also another proposal from the Special Development Studio at Ford. This one was rejected largely because it looked too much like the Cadillacs of the era. By the way, for anybody looking for a great book on Lincoln design, I highly recommend the book by Jim and Cheryl Farrell called Lincoln Design Heritage. It's an absolutely home run, well-researched book and a perfect one for your coffee table or just to read and enjoy. Regardless, the 1970 Continental certainly made a statement from an exterior styling standpoint with its large and in-charge styling. And I find in particular the 1970 to 72 models especially handsome. But let's turn a bit to the interior for these Continentals, where there were some interesting features that weren't found on other Lincolns of the era, and in particular talk about the instrument panel theme for the 1970 to 77 model years. The new for 1970 Lincoln Continental's instrument panel departed significantly not only from the outgoing 1969 Continental model's dashboard, which is shown here, but also from the 1969 Mark III dashboard. More specifically, the Mark III had 5 pod-style instruments and controls that were right at the eye level of the driver. Beginning from the left, there was the oil pressure gauge up top and the fuel gauge at the bottom, then a speedometer pod, then a clock pod, then 2 gauges to the right of that included the alternator charging as well as engine temperature, and to the right of that pod were controls for the windshield wiper, washer, as well as the rear air vent. Beneath these pods were the air outlets as well as the radio and climate controls and rear defogger control if the car was so equipped. In this way, all of the gauges were right in line of sight of the driver, and somebody who was, shall we say, elder during the period didn't have to worry about looking through their bifocals to understand what the gauges were reading with respect to what was going on under hood or in the fuel tank. However, the 70 Continental's interior changed up this entire theme with this sort of inverted racetrack style IP. And up top, there was a rolling drum style speedometer. This was not the first time a rolling drum had been used for speedometers. They were used on a number of other vehicles, including cars like the 1961 Buicks. But Lincoln brought it back here, and it was the only Lincoln at the time period that had this type of speedometer. In effect, it's a rolling drum that spins as speed increases and helps provide readouts against the numbers that are on the display. Beneath this speedometer were 5 style pods. On the left of the driver, there was a gauge for the engine alternator charging, and then to the right of that was the fuel gauge. On the other side of the driver were the engine temperature gauge and oil pressure gauge. Note that these gauges were obscured a bit by the steering wheel and also were a bit hard to read for someone with bifocals who would have to look down at these relatively small gauges compared to the Mark III's larger style pods. In the rightmost pod was a clock. Beneath all of the pods on the passenger side of the instrument panel were the climate controls, and on the driver's side of the instrument panel were the wiper and washer controls. These are admittedly a bit hard to reach if the seat back were in a position for a taller driver. Another prominent feature of the 70 Continental instrument panel was the oversized and humorously large ashtray, which I suppose is appropriate for the time period. To the left of the rolling drum speedometer were 4 warning lights that illuminated when an issue occurred. At top left was a warning light for a door ajar. At the top right was a warning light for the parking brake being on. At the bottom left was a warning light for the headlamp doors not being open all the way. You would effectively pull the headlamp switch to activate the headlights, and this light would stay illuminated until the doors were fully open or if the doors had a problem. At bottom right was a light warning you of low fuel. And to the right of the rolling drum speedometer and above the radio were another series of warning lights and controls. One was the fasten seatbelt light. Next to that was a control for the power antenna, and next to that was a control for the rear defroster. But the overall coolest piece, at least in my opinion, of this interior, in addition to the aesthetically pleasing inverted racetrack theme, is this rolling drum style speedometer that provides just an element of theater as you're driving the car, and frankly works especially well. It not only looks cool, but it's also easy to read. Let's take a look at this brief video of me driving my 1972 Continental, and you can see how this rolling drum style speedometer works in operation. Let's start it up. It does have gas. Well, there we go, the fuel light went out. Sometimes it stays on. That's a sender issue. Running good. Needs a new muffler. It rocks the car. Gotta love the 460. So cool. Huge glove box and big ashtray compartment here too. Car just feels huge. Very squinty greenhouse here too. Not much distance between the top of the dash and the top of the windshield. It's almost modern day Camaro-esque. Boy, does this sure look cool. That was kind of Ford's look back in the day. Very low roof lines. And here you can see the rolling speedometer drum in action. Unfortunately, the low fuel light is on. I got to fix the sending unit, and the fasten seatbelt light is on at the top right. I've since repaired that, but you can see the rolling drum here. It's reading 30 miles an hour. It just spins, and then you get to read the speed. Very easy, very simple to see, and I think it's quite cool. Just an overall neat touch on this particular interior, along with the overall theme, which is quite distinctive. And here it is one more time in action. Unfortunately, this dash would only last through the 1977 model year, as it would get costed out for the 1978 model year. But if you've got a Continental from 1970 to 1977, you definitely get this cool dash at the rolling drum speedometer. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the super thanks button. And until next time, take care.